Right now, tonight, on church lots and rural parcels and backyards across this country, there are people the government officially counts as homeless who are asleep behind a locked door they own. Not a shelter bed, not a tent, a small geodesic dome, bought online for around $2,000, assembled in an afternoon and quietly lived in. And the people buying them are not newcomers to homelessness. They are the veterans of the system, the people who have cycled through emergency shelters more than once, and who have stopped putting their names on the wait lists entirely. You will not find this trend in the annual point-in-time counts that cities use to measure their homeless populations. The major advocacy organizations do not mention it. The news outlets that cover the shelter system as a story of overcrowding and underfunding have never touched it. But inside the population that actually uses that system, everyone knows. The information moves through encampment conversations and private online groups, passed along by people trading the practical knowledge the official system will not give them. This video walks through the 8 hidden reasons behind the switch. Each one comes from people who have slept in both places, a shelter bunk and a dome on a patch of ground, and who arrived at the same conclusion independently. Each one contradicts what the organizations funded to manage American homelessness have been telling the public for decades. And by the end, you will understand why the people closest to the problem stopped believing the official answer, and why nobody whose salary depends on the shelter system will ever admit any of this on camera. Now, the first reason is the locked door. It sounds almost too simple to matter, and it is the single most cited reason in the entire community. A shelter dormitory is a large open room lined with bunk beds or floor mats, holding anywhere from 30 to several hundred strangers. Nothing in that room locks. Not the space around your bed, not the container holding your medication, not the bag holding your identification documents, your phone charger, and whatever money you have left. People who have stayed in congregate shelters describe the same experience over and over. You do not sleep in a shelter. You guard. You sleep in shifts with your shoes tied to your wrist and your documents inside your clothing, because the person in the next bunk arrived 2 hours ago and nobody knows anything about him. Theft inside shelters is so routine that most residents stop reporting it. A stolen ID card can take months to replace, and without it, a person cannot apply for benefits, cannot apply for housing, cannot cash a check, and cannot prove who they are to a police officer. A single theft inside a shelter can set a person's recovery back a full year. A dome shelter, by contrast, has a door. The door closes. The door locks. Everything the person owns is behind that lock, and for the first time since losing their housing, they sleep the whole night. Ask anyone who has made the switch what changed first, and the answer is almost always the same. I started sleeping again. But the locked door is only the beginning, because the second reason is the rules regime. Emergency shelters do not simply offer a bed. They offer a bed attached to a schedule, and the schedule is built for the institution, not the resident. Most shelters require residents to leave the building by 6 or 7 in the morning and do not allow them back until late afternoon. In between, the person is on the street, in the weather, carrying whatever they cannot leave behind. Curfews typically fall between 7 and 9 in the evening. Miss the curfew because a bus ran late or a work shift ran long, and the bed is given away. Many shelters require attendance at religious services, mandatory case management meetings, or program participation as a condition of staying. For a working person, the mathematics are brutal. A night shift job, the kind of job most available to someone rebuilding their life, is functionally incompatible with a shelter curfew. People in the community describe losing jobs to shelter schedules and losing shelter beds to job schedules, sometimes in the same month. A dome on a legal patch of ground has no curfew, no lockout, and no mandatory meetings. The person keeps the night job, keeps the bed, and keeps the small measure of control over their own hours that housed Americans never think about because they have never had it taken away. Now, the third reason is who shelters force people to leave behind. The American shelter system is overwhelmingly segregated by sex. A married couple who loses their housing together will, in most cities, be separated at the shelter door. He goes to the men's facility. She goes to the women's facility, often across town. For couples in their 60s and 70s who have shared a bed for 40 years, that separation is often the deciding factor. It is the reason many of them choose a vehicle, a tent, or a dome over any shelter bed in the city. And then there are the animals. The overwhelming majority of emergency shelters do not accept pets. For an older person who has lost their house, their savings, and in many cases their spouse, the dog is not an accessory. The dog is the last remaining member of the family. Outreach workers across the country report the same pattern. Offer a shelter bed to a person with a dog, and the person refuses the bed. Every time. Not because they do not want shelter, but because the shelter is asking them to abandon the one relationship they have left. A dome shelter asks for no such trade. The couple stays together. The dog sleeps inside. And the community has concluded that any system whose price of admission is your marriage or your dog is not a system built for human beings. The fourth reason is the one people are most reluctant to say out loud, and it is sanitation. Congregate sleeping arrangements concentrate illness. Shelters have long struggled with outbreaks of tuberculosis, influenza, and norovirus, and the hepatitis A outbreak that tore through San Diego's homeless population in 2017 showed the whole country what happens when disease enters a crowded, transient population. The pandemic years made the vulnerability of large shared dormitories impossible to ignore. Bed bugs and lice move through shelter bedding no matter how diligently staff work, because the beds turn over nightly and the residents arrive from everywhere. People in the community describe throwing away every piece of clothing they owned after a shelter stay. And remember who we are talking about, because the unsheltered population is aging fast, with adults over 55 now one of the fastest growing segments of American homelessness. For a 70-year-old with a heart condition, a respiratory outbreak in a 200-bed dormitory can be fatal. A private dome with one occupant or one couple removes the exposure entirely. Your bedding is your bedding. Your air is your air. The people who switched describe the difference in blunt terms. In the shelter, I was sick all winter. In the dome, I stopped being sick. The fifth reason is the two-bag problem. Nearly every shelter in the country limits what a resident can bring inside, commonly to 1 or 2 bags. Everything else, the tools a tradesman needs to work, the photo albums, the winter clothing, the documents, the cookware, must be abandoned, stored at a cost the person cannot afford or left outside to be stolen. Think about what that rule actually does. It takes a person who has already lost their housing and forces them to liquidate the last physical evidence of their former life as the price of a mat on a floor. People describe standing on the sidewalk outside intake, deciding in real time which of their remaining possessions to throw in a dumpster. A dome changes that calculation completely. A dome in the $2,000 range typically offers between 100 and 150 square feet of secure, dry, lockable interior space. That is enough for a bed, a chair, storage totes, work tools, and the file box of documents that every path back into housing runs through. The community frames it simply. The shelter makes you smaller every time you enter it. The dome lets you stop shrinking. Before we get to the sixth reason, which is the legal detail this entire shift quietly depends on, one short note. If you are watching this because you are close to the edge yourself, or because someone you love is, I put together a resource called The Veteran's Blueprint. I wrote it originally for homeless veterans, but everything in it applies to anyone with almost nothing, and to the people trying to help them. It goes step by step through the survival and recovery strategies people in this community actually use, including the specific ones that do not fit inside a video like this. The link is in the description below. Take it, use it, pass it on. Now, the sixth reason, and this is the one that makes everything else possible. It is the permit gap. The model residential building code that most American towns and counties copy their local rules from contains an exemption that most people have never heard of. Small detached accessory structures below a certain floor area, commonly somewhere between 120 and 200 square feet depending on the jurisdiction, can be erected without a building permit. The exemption exists for tool sheds and garden structures, and it was never written with human shelter in mind. But the dome kits selling in the $2,000 range are sized, whether by accident or by very deliberate design, to land just under those thresholds. What this means in practice is that a dome placed on land with the owner's permission, a relative's backyard, a church parcel, a rural lot bought for a few $1,000s, or one of the sanctioned sites that cities have begun tolerating, from Austin's Community First Village to Portland's Safe Rest sites, occupies a legal gray zone that a tent on a sidewalk does not. To be clear, and this matters, the permit exemption covers the structure, not necessarily the act of living in it. Occupancy rules vary enormously from county to county, and people in the community spend real effort learning their local code before they buy. But the practical pattern is consistent. A tidy dome on private land with the owner's blessing generates almost no complaints, and code enforcement responds to complaints. An encampment tent generates complaints every single day. The dome population has, in effect, found the one narrow strip of legal ground the housing crisis left unguarded, and they are standing on it. The seventh reason is the cost mathematics, and this is where the story turns from practical to genuinely uncomfortable. American cities spend staggering amounts of money per shelter bed. City budget documents in places like San Francisco and New York show operating costs for a single emergency shelter bed commonly running between $25 and $60 per night, which works out to somewhere between $9,000 and $20,000 per bed per year, every year, forever. Newly constructed shelter facilities in major West Coast cities have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per bed to build before a single person sleeps in them. For a person living on a fixed Social Security income, that difference is not abstract. It is the difference between a housing solution they can actually reach and one that exists only on a government spreadsheet. A person, a church, or a family member can privately house someone for less than the system spends keeping that same person in a dormitory bed for 2 months. The community has done this arithmetic on the back of envelopes in encampments across the country, and the conclusion they reached is the conclusion any of us would reach. The system is not underfunded. The system is structured so that the money passes through institutions instead of reaching the people it was appropriated for. And once a person sees that, they stop waiting for the institution. Which brings us to the eighth reason, the one that pushed most of the switchers over the line. The waitlist. In nearly every major American city, shelter demand exceeds shelter supply. Beds are distributed by lottery, by phone lines that open at a fixed hour and fill in minutes, or by wait lists measured in weeks. A person in crisis tonight is told to call back tomorrow. An older woman sleeping in her car is told the women's facility is full until further notice. And the deeper queue, the one for actual permanent housing vouchers, is measured in years, with many big city lists closed to new applicants entirely. The shelter system, in other words, offers a bed you might get tomorrow, under rules that may cost you your job, your spouse, your dog, and your possessions. The dome offers a locked door tonight. When people in the community explain the switch to newcomers, this is the sentence they use: "Stop waiting for a bed in a building that has no bed for you." And after a person has spent 2 winters discovering that the sentence is true, the $2,000 dome stops looking like a desperate measure and starts looking like the only rational purchase available. Now, step back and look at what those 8 reasons combine into, because the pattern is bigger than any one of them. The dome provides the security, the autonomy, and the legal standing that the shelter cannot offer, while the shelter splits families apart, endangers health, confiscates possessions, multiplies costs, and cannot even promise a bed at the end of the line. The population that has experienced both sides did not switch because a dome is luxurious. A dome is a fabric and frame structure on bare ground, heated by a small stove in an American winter. They switched because on every dimension that determines whether a human being can stabilize and climb back out, the $2,000 dome outperforms a system that costs the public tens of thousands of dollars per person per year. That comparison should not be possible. The fact that it is possible is the actual story. And the reason you have not heard this story is the same reason you never hear stories like it. The organizations positioned to tell it are funded by the system it indicts. Shelter operators are paid by the bed and by the contract. Nonprofit budgets, city homelessness departments, and consultant ecosystems are built on managing the population inside congregate facilities, and a validated model where people house themselves for a one-time $2,000 purchase is not a program anyone can bill against. The advocacy groups fear, not without reason, that publicizing the dome shift hands politicians an excuse to cut housing funding even further. The media covers homelessness through the institutions because the institutions answer the phone. And so a shift happening in plain sight, on church lots and rural parcels and tolerated shelter sites across the country, goes unreported by every party that would have to admit something about itself in order to report it. All of this is happening in the wealthiest country in human history, a country that finds hundreds of billions every year for weapons programs, stadium deals, and corporate subsidies, while its federal housing agencies operate on a fraction of what it would take to actually house the people sleeping outside tonight. The people buying domes did not choose to spend an American winter inside a fabric structure because they wanted to. They chose it because the shelter system built in their name failed the basic test of being usable by the people it exists for, and because the mathematics of survival at the bottom of this economy favored a locked door they own over a bed they might be granted. The small white dome sitting behind a church tonight with a person asleep inside it is the physical evidence of a housing system that spends more per person to fail than it would cost to succeed, and of a population that finally stopped waiting for permission. The shelter industry cannot tell this story without indicting its own funding. The advocacy world will not tell it for fear of the consequences, so the people living it tell each other instead, in encampments, in church parking lots, and in private message threads, while the official numbers pretend none of it is happening. If any of this hits close to home, subscribe, because every week I cover the parts of the American housing collapse that the funded organizations will not touch. And send this video to anyone you know who is sitting on a shelter waitlist right now, or anyone trying to keep a parent, a friend, or a veteran off the street this winter. They will not hear it from the system. Winter does not wait for a waitlist, and neither should they.